Welcome, everybody. I'm Will Tagle, Dean at the Wisdom School in Ubiquity University, and I welcome you to our call today. This is an auspicious time, a pivotal time in the direction that we have on the beautiful blue planet Earth. Just this morning, we had a gathering of men, some native blood, some white blood, and we were talking about how this is not a very good time to be a white male in the United States for various reasons. And yet it's a beautiful time. And it's a beautiful time to be alive and a challenging time to be alive. And our topic today is neuroscientific perspectives and happiness, and particularly connected to the recent election in the United States. We have people from all over the world who are joining us, so this is not just about the United States, but this is about us as one people, one humanity, and one earth. But before we go too far today, again, I want to just say that here in our outlet in the hill country of Texas, we have several people here in the room with us in a kind of global wisdom call party that we're having. So if you see various people in the background, we're having a gathering in person as well as online. And to begin today, I'm inviting Judith to bring some of her singing medicine to help us orient ourselves today.
Thanks, Will. Cheers to the party. Okay, we'll have a song. Spirit, weave our circle tight. Hold us in your perfect light. Earth, air, fire, and water leads us to you. That's a wonderful tune with many, many, many verses and words to that tune. So thank you. Good.
And also, to tune up our neural systems today, we're having a cold rain here where we live. And as I said, a number of us gathered this morning around the fire outside in a pavilion and felt the warmth of the fire. Is cold outside, but warm in our hearts, warm in our neural systems, warm in our connections with each other. So we bring that here to you today. And it's our privilege to have with us coming from Bolivia, Jim Hickman. And you read about Jim's bio in the announcement of our gathering today, but I do want to mention a couple of items there. And Jim is a crucial person in Ubiquity University, and also a powerful and spiritual presence. And I count Jim as one of the pivotal persons in my life today, and I welcome you to be with us as someone who has explored over a long period of time the neuroscientific perspective as related to meditation and other resources. So Jim, thank you for being with us, and we're going to hear from you for a few minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Judith, for opening my, whatever that sound does. It certainly opened it up. It's also raining here, Will, in Bolivia. So if there's any disturbance in the internet force, we'll compensate in some way. to really provide a kind of introductory background to the topic Will just described. I need to run through a number of essential concepts that will lead us into potential practices that for me are aspects of a path that we can all walk, simple path, but challenging to remember. We can all walk toward greater fulfillment in our lives, including happiness and other aspects of becoming more fully human. And then, as Will suggested, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the very specific environment we find ourselves in, not just in the United States, but in the world, actually, with a new president who, by his nature, is disruptive and therefore has huge potential for dramatic and positive change in the world. The question will always be, how will that disruptive nature move into the future in ways that hopefully benefit all of us? But that's not just about the United States. As many of you know, this is a very important weekend in Europe. And between now and the end of May, Europe may change its entire political structure, much more in line with what's happened in the US presidential election. So it's important that we all, wherever we're from, note that a future is unfolding that we have yet to really understand, but offers tremendous, significant opportunity. And on that note, I want to bring a few PowerPoint slides to illustrate my comments. Now, they're packed with information. You do not have to pay real attention or remember all these things, but I would encourage you to take a note now and then if something attracts your attention, so we could go into it a little more deeply during the discussion session. And then for those of you who are interested, I'm willing to send a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation to any of you who want to look at it a little more quickly, because we want to limit my comments here for the first 10 minutes or so. And so I'm going to run through these slides fast, but with the notion of try and get an experience of what I'm going to say without always trying to figure out whether or not you remember.
Jim, let me interrupt you just a second, and along that line to say if people, particularly who are coming to us through a device, you can scroll down to the bottom of the page of the screen, and you'll see a chat box, and you can click on that, and while Jim's talking, questions and comments and so on that you have, you can bring those in, and then when Jim finishes talking, we'll bring some of that chat into our discussion.
Here we go. As you can see, there are a number of different topics in this little show, and so we're going to go through them quickly. First, a bit about looking into the future. For many of us, the future looks dark. Now, what does that mean? Well, about 6 months into World War I, Virginia Woolf wrote, "Perhaps darkness is the best thing the future can be, because it is inscrutable." It's not terrible. It's just filled with possibilities, both light and dark. And it's up to each of us to find the light and make it shine. More recently, Rebecca Solnit, in her book, Hope in the Dark, came up with a very good phrase: the future is dark, with a darkness as much of the womb as of the grave. A part of happiness, part of all of our emotional content and what we make of it, is about our perspective. So I wanted to start with a couple of comments on perspective. First, we start from the universe. We should remember, or we ought to be able to, in some way, experience that we're traveling through the universe at 850 kilometers per second. And that in the time I've just talked, we've traveled thousands of miles through space. Our planet zooms around the universe, around the solar system, which is zooming around the galaxy, which is zooming around the universe. It's really hard to comprehend, but it's important from a perspective point of view for us to remember that planet Earth is zooming around a massive solar system, it's zooming around an even more massive galaxy. It's hurtling through an unfathomably large universe. And in the time I have said these several sentences, we've traveled 100,000 kilometers through space. So that's one perspective. Then, from a species perspective, we're human beings who can think. We climbed down from trees onto the earth around 250,000 years ago, and now we've detected ripples in the matrix of space-time that show us that time and space are in fact malleable. Look at where our brain, our capacity to think has come over these 250,000 years, including the definition of quantum physics that now shows us the mind and matter are inexplicably entwined, and our internal experience has an influence on how that time-space reality forms itself. And related to that, from a personal perspective, when I'm filled with despair, I can remember counterexamples of human goodness and kindness that turn despair into hope and joy. As the late historian, I can't quite see the whole thing. As the late historian Howard Zinn wrote, to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. And a little bit about happiness, and this is a part of what we'll learn and go into greater detail in the course that we're going to teach next year through the Wisdom School on the art of happiness. First of all, happiness is an experience that seems to have been around for at least 250,000 years and possibly 1 to 2 million years, when the very beginning of our current brain, heart, mind system was emerging out of the animal species. It's been written about for as far back as 2,500 years, with Confucius, etc. It's so compelling that, according to research, happier people have better overall health and live longer than their less happy peers. Very important aspect of pursuing happiness. Then, a couple of things that the world is trying to do. There's the World Book on Happiness, published in 2011. 100 top experts look at their findings and the best way to find happiness. There's a World Happiness Index that comes out every year, surveys numerous people from various countries to figure out which country has the happiest population. The World Happiness Report is a measure of happiness published by the UN over the past 4 years, and it looks at various indicators that measure well-being, and, as they say, can then be used to effectively assess the progress of nations. And it takes some action. The United Arab Emirates recently appointed its first Minister of Happiness to assist Dubai to become the happiest city on the planet. That's Dubai's affirmation at the moment. Bhutan is the first and so far only country to have officially adopted gross national happiness instead of gross domestic product as their main development indicator. In the US, certain states have done this as a happiness progress indicator that certain states measure alongside their gross state product. In the Great Britain, the Office of National Statistics is currently measuring national well-being. For the last 4 years, the General Assembly has celebrated, of the UN, has celebrated March 20th as the International Day of Happiness. And they established this with the statement that happy people are healthier, they get sick less often and live longer, they're more likely to get married and have fulfilling marriages, they have more friends, they make more money, they're more productive at work, and based on decades of research, it's become clear that happiness is not just a personal issue. It's a matter of public health. global economics, and national well-being. It is, in fact, becoming a primary concern issue for all countries in the world. And in this International Happiness Day, there's an Action for Happiness pledge, which everyone takes. I will try to create more happiness in the world around me. We're responsible for what happens. And how do we do that? Well, one thing is the Harvard study of adult development, interestingly, the longest study of adult life. It's tracked 724 men, but started a long time ago, and they didn't in any way recognize they should have been men and women, but they tracked 724 men throughout their entire lives for 75 years. And the main thing they found is the good relationships keep us happier and healthier. So strengthening your happiness feelings, very important. Exercise. Physical activity, as we know, changes certain aspects of the brain's biochemistry and makes us feel better. Pray, spirituality, and religious involvement is linked with greater well-being and happiness. Laugh. In addition to relieving stress, laugh boosts mood and reduces symptoms of anxiety and depression. Go for a stroll in a nature setting. Merge with the eco-fields. Become a part of the greater natural environment within which we all dwell. And again, research shows that people are happier in natural environments than they are in urban environments. And perform an act of kindness. Do something nice for someone else today because it'll make you happier. Now, how does this all fit together with the neurosciences? So I'm going to give you a quick tour of the brain to give you a sense of what happens inside our awareness that affects all of these things we're talking about. First, the brain. It's probably the most complex thing. It's certainly the most complex thing we know of in the entire universe. Small little packet of tissue, 1 trillion cells, and 86 to 100 billion neurons, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's always on, 24/7. 20 to 25% of all of the natural resources of the body are used by the brain, even though it's only about 20 to 30% of the mass of the body. Neurons fire incredibly fast, 5 to 50 times a second. Signals are crossing your brain in 1/10 of a second. And each neuron is connected to 5,000 other neurons through synapses, which we'll look at in a minute. 500 trillion little gaps between which neurons communicate that affect everything that affect and are affected by everything we believe, think, feel, say, do. And, very important. When I was growing up, when I was 15, I remember my first physiology class, and I was told that the brain, at the age of 15, at my age, your brain is now fixed. It'll never be different than it is on that day. But in fact, we now know that we actually make 10,000 new neurons every day until we die. And that directed mental activity can systematically alter that brain structure and function. And here's how it works. Just very quickly, don't worry about the details, but up here in the upper right, I'm wondering if this pen is going to work here. Pen. Can you see that pen? I'm highlighting up in the upper right. There's a neuron, okay? It's an artist representation, but basically there's a neuron. And you see down the axon, it is connected to another neuron. Now remember, there are about 5,000 of these neurons connected, each one. In the lower right, you see a little image of what is important here, the synapse. In the lower part of the lower right picture, it says the synapse, and you can see it's a small gap between the place where the neuron transmits its information and where the receiving neuron receives its information. And here's one of the important things about this. Henry Stapp, who is one of the preeminent quantum physicists in the world and wrote recently the book Mindful Universe, who's very much involved with quantum physics and the mind, says that these little red circles here, which are neurotransmitters, are calcium ions. And the size of that calcium ion is larger than this little blue area where the ion is received by the neighboring neuron. And he says the only way that calcium ion can go into that receiving area of the neuron is by quantum mechanics. It can't happen in the physical world. At the very fundamental structure of our neuronal function is a quantum process. So, something to remember. So what's happened over these years is that, especially 250,000 years ago, when we first began to develop the capacity to actually respond in a way that has a past and future, we developed primarily what we call a negativity bias in the brain. From an evolutionary perspective, it was much more important to remember the tiger in the grass than the berry on the bush. Because if you missed the tiger once, you were gone. No more DNA, no more replication. But the berry you can find again tomorrow. So the negativity bias has become ingrained in our brains in such a way that it was essential to the survival of the species for a long time. Unfortunately, what's also happened is that same negativity bias has become ingrained in our culture and throughout civilization. We've become a whole community of cultures that looks at the world mainly from a negative point of view, and no longer do we need that for our survival. And the remedy is not to suppress these negative feelings, but to foster positive ones, which is now we know possible because of neuroplasticity. The fact that the brain constantly is capable of reforming itself, rewiring itself in response to thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and our focus of attention. And this is where the integration of neuroscience and quantum physics begins to point to a world in which conscious thoughts and volition can and do play a powerful causal role. Directed mental activity can systematically alter brain structure and function. We call it self-directed neuroplasticity. As William James expressed, attention allows us moment to moment to choose and sculpt how our ever-changing minds will work, to choose who we will be in the next moment in a very real sense. And we know that if we recognize a positive experience, enrich it, feel it deeply, extend it in time inside of our experience for about 20 to 30 seconds, and repeat this several times a day because we have hundreds of positive experiences that happen to us all the time, then the brain begins to reform its neuronal structure in a way that positivity begins to be a more dominant impulse than the negativity bias. And all it takes is 20 to 30 seconds in a row. And doing that any moment won't really change your life, but if you take care of the minutes, the years will take care of themselves. Life is made of minutes, and we have a brain that's constantly changing its structure based on those moments. Our opportunity is to turn good moments into a great brain. So here's a basic, what I call Trump resilience practice, taking in the good, which is just what we're talking about. Increase neural pathways and synaptic connections in such a way that the regularity and depth of positive feelings and experience become the primary goal of our brain's activity on a regular basis. Look for and take in positive experiences. And every time you take in the good, you build a little bit more of neural structure. You do this a couple of times a day, then you turn everyday good experiences into good neural structures. You begin to train your brain. Dr. Richie Davidson, one of the premier neuroscientists in the world these days, says that our brains are constantly being shaped. See, this is the point. They're constantly being shaped, either wittingly or unwittingly. And most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly. In other words, everything we're thinking, feeling, talking, doing is shaping our brain. And if we begin to take more responsibility, then we have an opportunity to intentionally shape our minds, and then we shape our brains in ways that enrich our lives. You can use your brain, you can use your mind to change your brain, to change your mind for the better. Your experience truly matters. Gratitude is one of those, in addition to taking in the good. I'm not going through all of this, but I love this phrase. If gratitude were a drug, it would be the most popular drug in the world. And that's because of what you get from being grateful. And here you can look at this later, 31 benefits of gratitude that just come from taking a few minutes every day to acknowledge all of those aspects of our lives for which we're grateful. So practices for this world. First of all, recognize things change. Political movements come and go. If you try and hold on to the way you think things are supposed to be, without a doubt, you'll suffer, because everything changes. And then it gives us the chance to be in this moment. Let our thoughts go, breathe, and just be in this moment, not the past, not the future, but right here. Develop emotional granularity. We can talk a little more about this if people are interested, but it's a way of distinguishing the subtleties within your emotions. And the deeper and more sophisticated we become about identifying how we're feeling, then the greater opportunity we have to create a brain and experience a life that we really want. Practice compassion. Good time for those of us who may not have voted for Donald Trump and wonder what the future looks like. Listen and try to understand both your allies and your adversaries. Understand their motivations. See how they see life and their future in it. And do something nice for someone else. Said it before. We don't fashion a world by ourselves. We do it together with others. Daily gratitude acknowledged. What am I grateful for today? All of this is related to weaving neural pathways in the brain. Changing neural structure and function proceeds by activation to isolation, short-term memory buffers to long-term storage. That's why you want to do 15 to 20 seconds. It moves from short-term memory buffer to long-term storage. Repeatedly experiencing and acknowledging experiences of compassion. You become more grateful by repeatedly installing experiences of gratitude. You become more mindful in the same way, without turning passing mental states into enduring neural structure. There's no learning. There's no change of the brain. And so the question is, what fraction of your beneficial mental states ever become neural structure? Now, within all of that, we're talking about a path that we can all walk. It's a simple path. These are guideposts that come primarily from neuroscience along a path toward conscious use of our internal resources and becoming more fully human. The path is simple. Remembering to walk it is more challenging. And so I end this introduction with a personal story, because I have fears too about the future. And they're anchored in my past, as most of our fears are, but I wanted just to touch on them because acknowledging and knowing and saying yes to our fears helps reduce their intensity and gives us an opportunity to move more deeply into the darkness of possibilities. So we all know that during the president-elect's campaign, he was accused of fondling a number of different women, and various people on both sides either crucified him or forgave him or said it didn't happen. And the thing is, this is a part of the media that we have to liberate ourselves from. They focus on a couple of specific events as if that's news, but it isn't about Donald Trump. It's about the context of our culture. And he's a man in it, like I am, like many people listening, and we all have this deep within us because our culture has trained us in it. In the United States, the rape reported every 6 minutes. Every 6 minutes, 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime. That's our culture right now of women and men. Over 1,000 homicides a year committed by men who murder their partners or their exes. In the 10 years after 9/11, more women were murdered in this way than all the US soldiers who have died in the war on terror. When did you ever last hear this statistic? Because we don't get the context. A woman is beaten every 9 seconds in the US. You see this picture of me holding up a sign. I'm in Bolivia, and this was a vigil we were holding outside the Hall of Justice of Bolivia. And my sign says 53% of the women of Bolivia are beaten every day. How many more are we going to let this happen to? And when I was doing this, I thought, oh God, this is terrible. And then I began to look at what's going on in the United States, and it's even worse, or at least as bad. Male spouses are the leading cause of death to pregnant women in the US. And if we talked about it, you see, we get into talking about masculinity or male roles of patriarchy, but we don't as a culture want to talk about that because we're run by a bunch of men. Women have done everything possible to move into this frame, but we have a deep cultural bias about this. And my primary concern about the darkness is the further denigration of the woman in our culture. And what that means is a significant loss of talent, intelligence, sensitivity, and caring that our country needs for its future. Now, that's the present alarm. However, there's also the perspective from the past. And I want to just end this with a little story that was important to me as I was involved with anti-war activity some years ago. It's about embracing the darkness, the unknown, the unknowability, and refrain from letting cultural images dictate how we feel. Women's Strike for Peace. Some of you may remember it was the first great U.S. anti-nuclear movement, actually. It began in 1961 when 50,000 women brought together for Women's Strike for Peace, and they marched in 60 cities across the United States to object against nuclear weapons. The largest national women's peace protest of the 20th century, Women Strike for Peace. And it included a daily vigil outside the White House, where between 50 and 150 women would get together, and they would just stand there like the women on the right with these signs saying, President Kennedy, please handle the Cuban Missile Crisis so that our children are not harmed by all of what this possibility might be. And the interesting story to me is that on one rainy morning, there were about 17 women standing outside the White House like these women, and one of them told later how foolish and futile she felt standing there in the rain protesting at the Kennedy White House. Well, not far off from them was a man, Dr. Benjamin Spock, who at the time was the parenting guru of the United States. And he watched these women standing in the rain, exercising their feeling and expressing their feeling about the dangers of the darkness that were coming. And that changed his life. It was that moment when that woman felt foolish and futile that he said, this is what my life should be about. And he became one of the most high-profile anti-war activists in all of history. Unseen ripples in the now make great waves in the tomorrow. So our task here is to act with our heart and our minds and all of whom we know we are in ways that bring us into that darkness to find the light and let it shine. And that's what we're all about. And I encourage everyone here to use some of these practices, but always remember that what the future holds is up to each one of us to make of it, because it's a realm of probability. And who we are inside, as they say in quantum physics, collapses the probability wave and materializes experience and action into the material world in a way that then the future becomes the present. That's enough for now, Will.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that. And that's a burst of creativity from Bolivia, and I appreciate it so much. And for all of those of you who are viewing, particularly, you can go down to the chat box. Some of you have been over in the question and answer box, but it works better if we're on the chat. It works either way. And some questions are coming up. And also, before I get to the questions, Jane Church asked, please send me a copy of the PowerPoint, and Jane put her email address. So any of you who would like a copy of this rather profound PowerPoint, then you can either go to the chat box or the question and answer and put your email address, and we'll send you a copy of this PowerPoint. Also, Julia Stewart asked Jim the question, would you say a bit more about the phrase emotional granularity?
Yeah, it's a, let me just close this thing here. It's a phrase that has recently come into usage in the psychology world because, and I've got a couple of slides on it I can add to this presentation for later. But it basically is about, for example, you have an experience and you say, oh my goodness, I feel depressed. Well, that's not really the feeling. And so what you want to do is get into the minutia of what it is one really feels. You know, I feel sad. Pardon? Did someone say something?
No, go ahead.
Oh, and it is in the granularity of it that that has a significant impact on people's here's a little slide. It's what they describe as an individual's ability to differentiate between the specificity of their emotions. So, for example, when you learn about climate change, you could feel alarm tinged with sorrow and regret. And that's a little bit more than just feeling that. It's a little more granular in a sense than just feeling overwhelmed by it all. Or with the recent presidential campaign, not the election, but the campaign itself. You're sort of, you know, you can feel astonishment, exasperation, even sort of embarrassment on behalf of the candidates who spent so much time in the negativity bias, I would say. So there's growing scientific evidence that precisely tailored emotional experiences are very good for you. And that the benefits of what they call high emotional granularity are not only psychological, they also, people with that capacity also live longer, they have healthier lives, they go to the doctor less, they use much less medication, and your brain, it turns out, constructs your emotional states. Many of you may understand this, that what happens in your brain is a complex of integrating input from a wide variety of sources inside the brain, and that we can learn diverse concepts of emotion that are better equipped to create more finely tailored emotions. So they say that emotional granularity has a significant influence on your well-being and health. It gives your brain more precise tools for handling challenges that life throws at you. And I can send you some of these notes in the slideshow, because it also relates to things like reality modeling of the brain, and it points to things we can, again, it gets back to, we can train our minds to change our brains to become more finely tuned, emotionally granular aware human beings, in a sense, and it's good for us.
Good. In a few moments, I want to have Heather Ash Amara to come on and respond. But first, I want to comment. By the way, we're getting great responses on the chat screen for people wanting this copy of this PDF, this PowerPoint. I've been thinking, Jim, I want to see how you respond to this. I know that there is this research preoccupation, I would put it, with the negativity bias. And I've been thinking that this is really the negativity bias, the preoccupation with the negativity bias and with our brains may be because we're paying attention to the ancient people who were in the context of survival and competition with the jungle cats, for example. There's also great information that's emerging about the cooperation between the species and ancient people. And I would say, having been around a campfire all morning this morning, that the ancient people also in our neural systems give us a positivity bias, that this negativity bias that is valid is also balanced out biologically with a positivity bias. So I'd be interested in your response to that.
Well, I would answer it in the following way. Interesting thing about the brain. Remember that this neuroscience stuff comes very recently in our perspective on things. We've learned more about the brain in the last 20 years than we have known in the entire history of the species, and it's still coming. So, as is our tendency, we like to fasten on the latest great idea, and then we turn it into, the Bible. And that's a part of what's happened here. Positivity bias, the positivity possibilities of the brain have become, a very important aspect, one of counseling and psychotherapy. It's not something new, but it's something we now have an explanation for, in a sense. And it comes out of, obviously, years of listening to complaining patients. And I don't just mean patients, but all of us. All of us, we have within us this emphasis on, for example, on what someone says to us that we don't like. So I remember it, I leave the house and one of my big challenges is navigating traffic in Bolivia, where they drive differently. They have different traffic habits than I was grown up to adopt. So from my point of view, what is that guy cutting in front of me all the time? So when I leave, when I leave the house every morning, I'm like, okay, I'm feeling good. Life is good. Look at this wonderful eco field in which I dwell, and Danny's having a great time. And what is this guy? What did he do here? Or my wife is like, stop! That guy's gonna come again. And for the next 5 or 10 minutes, that's what I'm thinking about. Because as I said in that last slide, or in one of the slides toward the end, the path is simple. The challenge is remembering. And so, on the one hand, we have this innate focus on, in a sense, negativity that unfolded 250,000 years ago, when before everyone came into groups and, knew about all these other ways of being in the world that the indigenous people are teaching us again, helping us remember. What was most important was making sure that the next day we didn't get eaten. Now, at the same time, once that day was done, and we went back to, let's say, the cave around the campfire, that was when happiness began to emerge, because all of those other concerns were gone. But those concerns, in a sense, immerse themselves in our brainstem, and this is what I think you're pointing toward, Will. You see, we have this fundamental aspect of our brain upon which all of what came later has still grown out of, and we haven't let it go. And so we still spend our time walking down the street, in a sense, as actualizing the caveman brain. Caveman, cavewoman, caveman brain. And it's no longer relevant because, as you point out, as we as a species emerged into communities and developed relationships with one another, then these other aspects of our possibilities with nature, with other species, with ourselves, began to emerge and brought that forth in the brain. Now, the interesting thing for me, as a final statement about the brain, that this neuroscience points out, is that it's interesting when I read, an ad for a seminar on Become the Superhuman. Well, my view is we are subhuman right now, because we still spend most of our time in a part of our brain that developed a long, long time ago. But to become more fully human is to engage exactly what you're describing, Will. That our brain was designed, one, to survive, so we went all the way, but also it has inherent in it the possibility to go beyond all of that and balance it out, or even exceed the negativities influenced by this positivity, which comes largely from relationships with others, being in community, listening to the elders, etc., that you're speaking toward.
Yeah, and I want to point to Lynette Schultz's comment from Canada. She says, I think it is the Western mind that is just now discovering these things. As you said, Will, this is ancient knowledge. And also Midwest Steve says, not a question, but Buddhism teaches that we can change the way we think by watering the seeds of emotions that we choose, that we can choose. So water the seeds that are good and wholesome, says Midwest Steve. Now let's go to Heather Ash Amara, and Heather Ash, give us a response to this burst from Bolivia.
I love it, the burst from Bolivia. So Sheila and I are in Austin at a Warrior Goddess weekend. We were just listening as we walked up here, and just, Jim, it's so wonderful to hear you and to, as always, feel your enthusiasm, which is blended with such great wisdom and tools to remind us that we can capture really our own attention, because that's what we're learning how to do, is to watch where our brain goes and to really become intimate with our brain, to listen, to watch, to pay attention, so that we can then begin to make these shifts that we're talking about. And one of the things that we were working with today is this idea that each of us is a storyteller, that's what our brains are designed to do, is to tell stories. And that, as Jim was mentioning, that, and Will as well, that there's a part of it that's biological, there's a part of it that's training of what we've learned, is to make up negative fear-based scarcity stories. And we see that reflected in our media and in advertising. And we also have the capacity then to step back and hold the part of us that goes into fear and goes into disaster and make up stories, and then ask ourselves, what story do I really want to be telling myself? And I found that it's not about saying, oh, I'm not allowed to be afraid, or I can't be negative ever. that doesn't work because that's not holistic. But to really honor and name what's the fear? What am I telling myself? And then to begin to massage the story and look at what are different points of view. What's the way that I can rewrite a story? So I hear so much parallel as we've all been talking about around modern science that Jim brings forth so beautifully and ancient wisdom, and that we're at such an amazing time right now as humans with what's happening on the planet to stake a claim inside of ourselves and really deeply ground into holding our own fears, watching the negativity, being with the fear, and choosing again, and choosing where do we want to put our attention. And that's a lifetime journey of making that choice over and over again, not just once. Be so great if we can just go, okay, I'm just going to be positive from here on out, and I'm done. But it's making that choice over and over again. So thank you so much, Jim, for sharing your wisdom, and for Judith and Will.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to point to a question now, Jim. This is a very interesting question from Jane Jack Morales. She says, I'm thinking about the quantum process that allows these calcium particles to fit into the receptors of the neuron. I wonder if light transmission through the fascia influences that process by its ability to move light energy through the body. So, Jim, there you go.
It's a good wonder. It certainly makes sense to me. And I would assume that I mean, as we know, light is made up of quantum particles. So it would make sense that in the quantum world, or so much of what you're pointing to, Jane Jack, is alive in a sense. That the interaction among those quantum pieces, quantum energies, quantum somethings, there's something we can't name, but in that quantum experience, that these various packets of quantum energy influence one another in ways that are, that can be both destructive and constructive. So I think in addition to, like, for those of us who, for example, use light in a variety of ways for our own healing or for others, I think combining it with the kind of mental processes, attention, as Heather Ash emphasized, that are consistent with what one's goal is in the healing, certainly makes both of those processes much more effective. And I think the way you've described it, Jane Jack, is a really good way to sort of imagine how these quantum processes interact in a way that gives us our responsibility back. Because it isn't just about, here, I'll give you some laser light, and you're going to feel a little better. It's also about, let's get into the right frame of mind. So at that level of the synapse where these calcium ions are engaged in a quantum process that are related to how you think, feel, act, and talk, it's a combination of the positive effects that the light brings, that the quantum aspect of the light brings, and the quantum aspect of the thought brings, to combine them and make them more effective. I mean, that's what I would think. I would say one other thing that I neglected at the very beginning. We talk about the brain. Heather Ash knows this, Will knows this. And we use it because it's the way we all think about mind, but it isn't just the brain. It's the heart. And now we know the gut has neurons that are directly connected to the brain in such a way, like the heart and the brain, in such ways that they are so completely intertwined that to some degree, neural networks inside the heart have their own functioning that mirror the neural networks inside the brain. And the same thing happens inside the stomach. That in such a way that when we talk about neuroscience, in the traditional sense, it's about the brain, but in the larger sense, it's about our whole system, which contains a number of different elements, all of which are neuron-driven in a certain way, that affect all of how we make decisions and how we feel, and who we relate to, and how effective light is when it's used in combination with attention to our calcium quantum process.
Okay, good. And here's a question. We have time for a couple of more questions. This is from Pippa Palling. I'll go down to her question. She says, I'm aware my own positivity and happiness is waning severely and the impact that can have on decision making. What advice do you have to keep on keeping on without allowing my own happiness to suffer, especially when leading a team of people whose happiness at work is paramount to me? So did you get that question, Jim? Unmute.
Yeah, I see the question now. Well, no, it's a moment by moment choice. Heather Ash emphasized this, that it isn't about, oh, now I'm not happy, that's not good, let me try and be happy again. It's about every moment choosing, because we understand that it is where we put our attention that affects all of who we are and how we feel and how we express ourselves, etc. So, and there are a couple of practices that were in the slideshow or that are elsewhere. So one practice I like that I named myself, back pocket positivity. Because one of the challenges is in those moments when I'm driving the car and I'm into my negativity because of whatever, the challenge is to move out of that so that doesn't become the primary neural structure of my brain, heart, mind, in a sense. And a way to do that is I carry what I say in my back pocket several memories that were some of the best moments of my life. And I can bring one of those out and remember how I felt, what I was doing, what came of it, the import it had in my life, the meaning it gave to me, all of which then installs that, or in a sense initiates that neural network in my brain to put me into that frame of mind and move me out of the other one. So when, in a sense, as you put it, Pippa, Ms. Palling, when your happiness seems to wane, especially during times of extreme stress, feeling overwhelmed, etc. I think there are two parts to this. One is, just basic mindfulness. Going back inside, focus on the breath, and watch, observe, move into the witness self. And allow all those feelings of overwhelm to be acknowledged and to let them go. And as one becomes a little more mindful of the present, then one can also bring back what I call one of these back pocket positivity moments to re-energize oneself, in a sense, direct that neuronal firing across those synapses. Because one of the things the neuroscientists say is that neurons that fire together wire together. And if you remember, there are, 5,000 next to each one, there's a trillion different signals going on inside the brain at any one time. When you bring coherence into that around a certain feeling, idea, thought, belief, that becomes the dominant geography, in a sense, of the brain and the mind, brain and the heart at that moment. And it brings you back into, in a sense, one's greater feeling of happiness, clarity, and the people around you feel it. It's also important to allow everyone around you to see who you really are, that sometimes you're not so happy. And I know that, this happens to me now and then. I'm like today, I'm thinking about this. How am I going to do this? And about this presentation. And my son comes up to me and says, "Daddy, are you all right?" And it immediately is my remembering. He's my remembering guru. Because as soon as he says that, I go back into, yeah, Daniel, I'm doing really great. I'm so happy that such and such. And that changes everything in my brain. So it's about awareness. It's about attention, as Heather Ash says. And then it's about responsibility for who we are and not being afraid to show both sides, because it's okay. Heather Ash spoke to this. It's okay and important to acknowledge those other feelings that we all have. So I did a whole slide on it. I'm afraid the women in the U.S. are going to suffer more. And that helps me. It helps me differentiate within myself what Heather Ash was saying, walking into the fear and letting it dissolve and allowing the darkness that's pregnant with possibilities to bring to me something a little bit more consistent with who I know I am. I don't know if that helped, but that's my response.
Good. Thank you, Jim. And Michael Troutman has asked a great question. And Michael, I'm going to have Dan promote you up to a panelist so we can see you.
While we're doing that, just Karen wrote, so it doesn't matter that the topic of the back pocket positivity has nothing to do with the fear we are feeling. It does not. That back pocket, I love that word. That's so brilliant. It can be anything from any time in your life. And it's then cultivating the strength of that so that you can call it up in a moment by just re-remembering it over and over and over again.
Okay.
I have just a quick note on that, Will, because I have one that came from my high school. When I was a senior in high school, I made an incredible play on the basketball court. And it was just an extraordinary thing for me and everybody else. I mean, I'm 16 years old or something. But I remember it so vividly, I keep it in my back pocket and I bring it back, not because of the event, but because of the feeling and what it brings to me.
Yeah, good thought. There's Michael Troutman, and Michael, let's see if we can bring you up so you can ask your question, because you've been at Standing Rock in recent times in the last week or so, and so maybe you'd ask your question live to Jim.
Thank you, Will. Well, unlike Jim, I don't have any fantastic basketball plays to call upon from the past. But I do have an amazing recent experience of having had the privilege of spending 4 days out at Standing Rock before Thanksgiving. And I was just struck by by many things, but it was an incredibly powerful spiritual experience for me. And the question I would raise in light of today's conversation, among the things I was struck by were some of the tribal elders who, despite centuries of genocide and the violence that's been experienced at the camp from the side of authorities, continued to remind us that we're all relatives and that This includes the sheriff's deputies, the company guards, those sitting just outside the camp in the military armored vehicles that were less than 100 yards away. And I just thought, that's not where my brain went naturally. And so is there a different experience in these last 10, 20, 30,000 years of some Native American people that perhaps their brains have evolved differently than European brains?
It's a wonderful question, Jim. What do you think about that?
Well, you know more about it than I do. I mean, I would, a short answer would be, yeah, I would imagine. You see, I would say, this is the possibility of the brain. This is the brain, heart, mind system, let's say, that we have this unbelievable capability to move into a different way of being. And yes, a number of cultures around the world throughout history have in a sense, developed that in an extraordinary way. Unfortunately, as someone mentioned, it's sort of Northern civilization. Unfortunately, the impact of Northern civilization is wiping this out all over the world. But yes, I would say that the more we can bond with and learn from and study with the native peoples of many different parts of the world, then the more opportunity we have to also begin to reconstruct our brains in ways that they probably have because of the lack of culture and civilization from the North, we might say.
Mm-hmm.
Will?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I am going to wrap this up so we can stay within the circle that we committed. And thank you so much. I want to acknowledge Sister Rosemary Stevens. I'm not sure where Sister Rosemary is writing from, but she says, I agree with Michael. The Native people see all as relatives, and it came so positively at Standing Rock. And over the next few months, we'll have more live connections with people from Standing Rock, I feel sure. But before we complete our time today, I just want to acknowledge something that we had a large number of people today, and you stayed with us the whole time through very substantial and rigorous material, and I appreciate that so much. Several of you, in fact, many of you have left your email address. I also want to mention that Jim will be offering a course in this general area of the psychology of happiness and the neuroscientific perspective in March. And if you leave your email address either on chat or question and answer through chat, Dan says it needs to be on chat. So the people who've left it on Q&A, do they need to transfer over to the chat?
Yes.
Okay. So if you left your email address on question and answer, take a few moments right now and move it over to chat. And if you do leave your email address, we'll send you details about the course that Jim will be offering later on in March. I'm pretty sure it will be in Northern California, and there may be an online component, and you'll get more information about that as we proceed. So before we finish today, though, I want to turn back and stimulate our neural systems with a little more singing. Judith, if you would come to excite our synapses a bit with your song.
Okay, thank you, Will, and thank you all for indulging my voice. There is only love. There is only love. Thank you all for your open hearts and the love that we all feel for each other. Oh.
Yeah, and one closing thought to support that song. As I have approached this post-election period, I actually have kind of taken on a spiritual practice of not paying too much attention to the news until January 20th. I also have adopted the practice of thinking about this whole political situation as if I'm walking on a pathway and I see a large snake that comes out on the path. And on the one hand, I'm frightened by the snake, but I put my fear aside and I bring up what Judah's singing about. That is my connection with the snake, my sense that this is a relative. And on the one hand, I'm very cautious and I'm looking to see, is this a poisonous snake? Am I in danger here? Or can I just observe and witness and focus on the connection that I have without bringing my fear constantly in front of me? And so I suggest this is a possibility as we move through this election period and keep something in our back pocket. See you next month. Look forward to it. Mataki Wasan.
Oh.
Oh.